Okay, good morning. I want to do something a tiny bit different than the last bunch of things that we did. I want to really chart out a little bit the machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and there's a Chanuka connection to this. Now, the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel play out across the Mishnayos and some of the Gemaras and different brises and etc. So most of the things should be familiar to most of the people. Probably not every single person, every single one of them, but let's just try to chart it out through the words of Chazal, and then get to the Chanuka element. So as follows: if someone who's learned Mishnayos and Gemara knows that they're replete with machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. There are, according to the calculation that's given, there are 316 machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel throughout Shas. Of those, 220 something of them are dinim, like actual halachas that are relevant. There's another 60 something of them that are drushes, like how to darshan a pasuk, how not to darshan a pasuk, and then there's another 60 something that are that might be too many already. 30 something or something that are siyagim, meaning there's a lot of gzeris that one or the other one of them made, and the other one was chelik on. So there's dinim, drushes, and siyagim. They're pretty evenly dispersed throughout all the starim of Shas. I think Nashim might have the most machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, which is just like a random thing, but they're pretty dispersed throughout all of Shas, and they're very, very, very benimtza. Now, what maybe not everybody knows is that before machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, machlokes as a metzias didn't really exist. There was not really such a thing called machlokes in halacha and Klal Yisrael. So I want to start like charting that from the beginning, and then we'll get to where it goes to. So the Mishnah in Chagiga, in the second parak of Chagiga, starts off with a machlokes about smicha, and it says as follows: it says Yossi ben Yezer Omer shaloi lismich, Yosef ben Yechanan Omer lismich, Yeshua ben Prachya Omer shaloi lismich. Nita Arbeli continues until it gets to the end of it. It says Beis Shammai Omrim. Shammai Omer, exactly. Actually, it says Beis Shammai over here, but yeah, no. The end of the Mishnah says, I have underlined the wrong part. Yeah, Shammai Omer Mevim ve'in Samchin, and Hillel Omer Mevim ve'Samchin. So you have over here the machlokes Shammai and Hillel that talks about the union of smicha on Yom Tif, right? This is the sugya of smicha on Yom Tif. Now over here you have a whole list of all the previous zugos, the different Tanoim, and even earlier than Tanoim, who spoke about this machlokes of smicha, and then it culminates with Shammai and Hillel arguing about the same thing. Now, this is a machlokes that more people are involved in, but Shammai and Hillel are like the primary ones who close out this machlokes. Now, the Yerushalmi, it's interesting, is that the Yerushalmi in Chagiga says as follows, and it's really Gemara and Shabbos, and I'll read it too. The Yerushalmi in Chagiga often it says like this: Barishayna, in the beginning, leihaisa machlokes b'Yisrael. There was no arguments in Klal Yisrael. There was no machlokes in dinim and arguments in Klal Yisrael. Ella ala smicha bilvad. The only machlokes was about smicha, like is delineated in this Mishnah. That there's many zugis and earlier dairis who argued about this. Va'amdu Shammai v'Hillel va'asuos and Dalid. Shammai and Hillel came and they made it 4. Now, what does it mean they made it 4? So va'asuos and Dalid means they made it 4 machlokes. They made it 4 machlokes because the Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Tesvav Medalef tells us it's a memory from Rav Huna begimel mekaymis nachlagu Shammai v'Hillel. There are 3 places that Shammai and Hillel had their machlokes. Shammai himself and Hillel himself had their machlokes. One of them is about the shear that you need in a dough in order to be chayiv and challah. One of them is about the shear of water, mayim she'uvim, that passes a mikvah, and one of them is about the chazakis by nida, by a woman who didn't, vestis, and chazakis by nida. So there's 3 machlokes that the Gemara in Shabbos tells us Shammai and Hillel argued about, and this one in Chagiga seems to be the 4th. So it says there was no machlokes in Klal Yisrael besides for this, Bo Shammai v'asuos and Dalid. So some of this one is not really, doesn't really go on Shammai and Hillel's record, because it's a machlokes. This is the first original machlokes that existed. There was one inyan that different, Tanoim argued about, but came Shammai and Hillel and they turned it into 4 machlokes because they argued about challah, mikvah, and challah, mikvah, and nida, in addition to the regular machlokes of smicha. Now, incidentally, there's also one more machlokes Shammai and Hillel themselves that also kind of doesn't make it to the list, and we'll see why. There's a Gemara in Beya that tells us on Tazayin Amar Aleph, the Gemara in Beya tells us Tanya Amru alav al Shammai Azakin. They said about Shammai Azakin Kol Yamav hayayich l'chveit Shabbos. All of his days he'd eat l'chveit Shabbos. Matzav heimana, any day of the week he'd find a nice animal. Emer Zula Shabbos. If he found the nicer one, he'd upgrade, start eating the first one and keep the second one for Shabbos. Hillel Azakin, he had a different anhaga with the Shekol Ma'asav L'Shem Shemaim, Shenem Baruch Hashem Yom Yom, and therefore he wouldn't go shopping until Erev Shabbos on Thursday, and he'd find something for Shabbos, and that would be his Shabbos food. So over here in the Gemara in Beis, seemingly you have another machlekes, Shammai and Hillel themselves. Maybe it's not like a din, mamish like a din, but it's a hanhaga. Call it a hanhaga musari, that there's a machlekes Shammai and Hillel about. Now, what's interesting is that many of the Rishonim, and the Bir Halacha brings this down in Hilchos Shabbos, feel that this is not really machlekes. That's a mitzad hachana l'Shabbos. Beis Hillel's maskim to Beis Shammai that a person should try to be meichel for Shabbos as often and as early as he can, meaning whatever amount of time in advance you can meichel for Shabbos is wonderful. Beis Hillel was saying that he had a personal midas habitachon, that he didn't have to take care of things on Sunday for Friday. Meaning nothing to do with Shabbos, nothing to do with Einik Shabbos, Kavod Shabbos, Hachanah Shabbos. Beis Hillel Stam said, I try to live on a Dahaibin Baruch Hashem Yom Yom. I try to live on a Dahaibin level of bitachon where I don't have to be busy esiking zich for the weekend when it's on Sunday. So it's not really a machlekes between Shammai and Hillel and Hagav Hachanah Shabbos. They both agree. Hachanah Shabbos is supposed to start as early as possible, as early as you need. But if you happen to be a big Baal B'tachon and you're able to set it aside, not wait till later in the week, so then that's your anhaga. So these are the three shleisha shem chamisha machleksim that Shammai and Hillel had themselves. There's three that the Gemara, the Yerushalmi and Chagiga and the Gemara and Shabbos tell us that they really argued about. There's the fourth one, which was smicha, that predates them, but they assumed that machlekes. And then there's the fifth one, which is the anhaga of Hachanah Shabbos, which is not really a machlekes because they really kind of agree, and it's just it's just around the margins. Now the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Peichas Amud Beis, tells us as follows. It says as follows: Amar Rav Yosi. Rav Yosi says mitchila, in the beginning of Klal Yisrael's history, lo yehi marbin machlekes b'Yisrael. There was not a numerous amount of machlekes in Klal Yisrael. Ela bezdin shel shivim ve'echad yeshvim b'lishkas hagazes. The bezdin of 71, the bezdin Haggadah would sit in the lishkas hagazes. V'shnei batei dinim shalasim v'shleisha, and there was two, subsidiary batei dinim, junior batei dinim of 23 that sat in the Beis Hamikdash also. Echad yeshiv al Pesach ha'Arbayis, ve'echad yeshiv al Pesach ha'Azara. And v'shar batei dinim shalasim v'shleisha yeshim b'chal ha'yaris. And then there was other batei dinim of 23 dayanim that were locally based in every city that had to answer to the bezdin that was on the lishkas hagazes. Chutzra chadav l'shoyl, if they had a question, shoylim bezdin should be Iran. First you'd ask the bezdin in your town. Im shamu, if they knew the halacha, amrulem, they would tell you, im lav, bo and lezesh samach liran. They'd upgrade, they'd go to the next appellate level to see the court that's above them. Im shamu, amrulem, im lav, bo l'al pesach harabayis. They'd go to the bezdin of 23 that sat at the mouth of the harabayis. Im shamu, if they knew amrulem, if not, they'd come to the one that was Pesach Hazar, which was a higher court. This is the shmooze, this is what happened until now. Now you fill in the blanks, now you tell us where we go from here. If they knew Amrulam, if not, they would go to the Bezdin Shabalishkas Hagazes of 72, Shesham Yoshvin, Mitaman Shal Shachar, Taman Shal Ben Arbayim, Uba Shabbos Yom Tevim, and then they would ask the question, B'fneim, Shamu, Amrulam, Vim Lav, Oimdim Leminyan, they would stand up and do a count, Rabu Hamatamim Tamu, Rabu Hamatar and Taharu. So there was a way to resolve any question, whether or not there was an answer on the books that people knew. It would go up the chain of the hierarchy of the Batei Dinim, and when it would finally arrive at the Bezdin Haggadah B'Lishkas Hagazes, either they knew the answer already, or they'd craft a new answer, and that would become the halacha. Says the Gemara, but Misha Rabu Talmidei Shammai v'Hillel Shishim Shulchan Tzarchan, when too many Talmidim of Shammai and Hillel who were not Meshamash Kol Tzarchan were on the scene, Rabu Machlekes b'Yisrael v'Nasa Torah Kishtei Torahs. They became a tremendous amount of Machlekes in Klal Yisrael, and the Torah became like two Torahs. So the Gemara tells us, and it doesn't tell us exactly how long it took, but this is, if you pay attention to the different Tanoim, who are associated with Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and the Gemara in Sukkah gives us a list of some of them, the Gemara Basra gives us a list of some of them, there's other Gemaras that mention different, Tanoim who were a Talmud of so-and-so, the Herzog of so-and-so, Rabbi Shua, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Tarfon. These are all people who had patronage to different Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. So if you chart it, you'll see that it's primarily in the years, like the Be'erach 180 years, the last 180 years of the bias. Now, everyone's learning Sanhedrin now, so if you're learning Sanhedrin, you know that that last kuf of the bias is when the Sanhedrin began diminishing in its power. Eventually, then that Sanhedrin has to go into Galus, and it goes from many different stops where it goes as Sanhedrin diminishes further and further. So says the Seder Adaris, this was not indictment of the Talmidei Shammai v'Hillel, that they were L'Shem Shul Kol Tzarchan, meaning that they had the opportunity to, the ability to, and they chose not to. The ability to be Mishamash Kol Tzarchan, to allow things to go their normal way, to be able to follow your Rebbe all the way up the chain of command, diminished over time. And therefore people a Talmud of Shammai and Hillel who lived in the Shtachim somewhere, who didn't have access to asking the whole proper way of asking, had to come to his own psak and had to, say, okay, this is what I know, this is what I'm working with, and had to come to his psak. So over time, over a period of, whatever, call it 100 years or something like that, it was Rabu Machlokes B'Yisrael till this original 3 to 5 Machlokes balloon into 316 Machlokes, which is a tremendous amount of Machlokes, in a short amount of time. Think about the great lack of clarity, the pall of lack of clarity that fell over Klal Yisrael. If you're talking about going from point A where there's kemat no machlokes and everything's a din, everything's clear, it's a mishnah, it's a Messiah, it is what it is, and then it turns into over a period of 100 years into 300 something machlokes, that's a tremendous shikchas HaTorah. That's a tremendous downgrade in the clarity of Torah that Klal Yisrael is working with. So much so that the Brisa in Masechtas Taina says that Tes Ba'adar, I believe, and as I Gepaskin the Shulchan Aruch in Tafkov Pei brings this down. Tes Ba'adar Nechalchu Beishamai B'Hillel. Beishamai and B'Hillel disagreed, and that's why you fast on Tes Ba'adar. That's what the Brisa in Masechtas Taina says, and that's the Shulchan Aruch paskins like that in Siman Tafkov Pei. So there was a tremendous amount of confusion and lack of clarity that settled on Klal Yisrael when this machlokes became widespread. Now, so just to put this machlokes into context, it's important to note that the Gemara in Yavamis, the Mishnah in Yavamis, and Daf Yud Gimel and Beis, tells us in the Mishnah that Afal Pisha Elu Oisrim Ve'elu Matirim, Elu Paislin Ve'elu Machshirin, which was a new phenomenon for people. Even though now you have people, these are being matir, these are being mekel, these are being matara, these are being matame, which was a new phenomenon. Still, Le'nimnu Beishamai Milisa Nashim Beis Hillel V'Lei Beis Hillel Beishamai. They didn't withhold from marrying each other's women, even though there were cases where there'd be nafkaminas la'alacha about the kashrus of their women. And kol ha'tahiris v'atmeis shayu elu matarin ve'elu matamin le'nimnu ois and tahiris elu agabe elu. And they trusted each other's tahiris and tmeya, affirmations and psakim. So they worked with each other. So the Gemara tells us that even though there was the Mishnah tells us that even though there was a lot of machleksim going on, overall they were nagu kavod zeh b'zeh. They maintained a certain civility even in psak with each other, where they shtaltzu to each other's psakim. Now, what happened? Eventually, even this civility begins to break down. The Gemara tells us, and this is interesting because the Gemara in Chagiga tells us this, and this is something that even seems to start very early in the lifetime of Shammai and Hillel. Now, Hillel was a big Ma'arich Yamim, so it's possible that Hillel came to Eretz Yisrael from Babel when he was 40, and became the Nasi at 80, and lived to 120. So Hillel had a very, very long and fruitful life. So it is possible that some of the original machlokes that Shammai and Hillel have, Shammai was the Ab Bezdin and Hillel was the Nasi, started when Hillel was 70, and this story took place when Hillel was 118. So there's a lot of clock left for the machlokes to develop even in Hillel's lifetime. Meaning Hillel lives for a lot of the development of this machlokes. But the Gemara in Chagiga in Beya and Daf Chaf tells us the story as follows. It says Maisa beHillel Azakin. There was a story with Hillel Azakin Shehevi Elase LaAzara. He brought his oila to the Azara Lismech Aleh B'Yamtif, to do what he held the halacha is, to be semich on his oila B'Yamtif. It says Chibrul of Talmidei Shammai Azakin, the Talmidim of Shammai Azakin ganged up on him, which maybe implies to us that Shammai Azakin was not on the scene anymore. Hillel Azakin was still alive, and Shammai Azakin wasn't there, but Talmidei Shammai, who were trying to establish his psak and to share his psakim and his teres, were on the scene. Amrullah, they told him, what's going on over here? Don't worry, it's not a oila. But the kishkishlav was navav hochlam, and he fooled them, he tricked them. He pretended he was going to pick up the tail to show them what type of animal it was. He fooled them, and they went on their way. Says the Gemara, that day, the hand of Beis Shammai was strengthened over the hand of Beis Hillel. And based on this Ma'aser Rav, so to speak, where they forced Hillel Hazakin to kowtow to what they wanted, to what the Talmidei Shammai wanted, they wanted to establish this as a halacha l'dairis. Now again, this implies to me that Shammai might not have been here anymore. There was an old Talmud who was from the Talmidei Shammai, meaning Hillel had tremendous arichas yamim. There was this old Talmud who was left over from the Talmidei Shammai, Ubava ben Buta Shmai, his name was Bava ben Buta, who knew already at that point that the halacha really has to be like Beis Hillel. He brought all the tzayin from Yerushalayim and brought them into the Azara, and he said, he made a tremendous scene out of showing that the halacha is like Beis Hillel, not like Beis Shammai. He said, anybody who wants to do smicha, come do smicha. And that day, through one of Shammai's Talmidim, the halacha became gepaskin like Beis Hillel, and nobody ever questioned that again. So you see that even though there was, they were nagu shalom b'zeh, there was a tremendous competition and desire to establish the halacha like one or the other, and that's verständlich, because each school of thought, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, both believed strongly that they were the proper Messiah, they were the real, what the Torah should be, what the halacha should be, and they were willing to be meiser nefesh to try to establish the halacha to be how they thought the halacha should be. Now, this battle of how the halacha should be comes to a head in a Mishnah in Shabbos in Daf Gimel and Beis. The Mishnah tells us that there was a Aliyas Chananya ben Chizkiah ben Garin, that where they were up there daning about the kashrus of the Sefer of Yecheskel, and it says, She'alu levakroi, many Talmidim went up to visit him, to pay him a visit. Nimnu v'rabu Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, v'yod dvarim gazer b'bayim. And that day, they made a count, and the Talmidei Shammai overwhelmed the Talmidei Hillel, and they were geyser 18 gzeros of that day. Now, to which the Gemara in Shabbos goes off into a few blatted discussion to figure out what are the 18 gzeros, which gzeros needed them to do, and etc., etc. Now, the Bavli in this regard is pretty tame. If you look in the Yerushalmi in Shabbos, in the beginning in the end of the first paragraph over there, Yerushalmi says as follows: Oiseh hayom, says the Yerushalmi, hayakasha li Yisrael kiyem shenasis by ha'egel. It was shver for Klal Yisrael like the day the egel was made. Rabbi Eliezer says, Bay bayom gadshu es asa. They overdid it. They did too much. Rabbi Shua says, Bay bayom machku esa. And the Gemara continues on to this, and the Gemara tells us that day there was thousands of Talmidei of Shammai who gathered around this house of Hanani ben Garin, and thousands of Talmidim in Beis Hillel, and they realized that this was the ultimate competition, the ultimate showdown to establish the halacha. And the Talmidei Shammai, it says, only 6 of them went upstairs to the Aliyah. The rest of them stayed around with swords, b'charbes and ramachim, with swords and spears, and guarded around. And they said, Hanichnas al yikanis, v'yikanis yidaka b'cherev. Anybody who's going to try to go in will be stabbed. Now, here's where it gets a little dicey. The Yerushalmi's mashma, at least the words of the Yerushalmi say that Oiseh hayom hargu Talmidei Shammai Talmidei Hillel. That day the Talmidim of Shammai killed the Talmidei of Hillel. Now, it's a machlokes and mefarshim on the Yerushalmi between the Pnei Moshe and the Karban Eidah. Does that mean that they actually killed, Talmidei Shammai actually killed Talmidei Hillel? Or does that mean they threatened to kill them if they would go in? Some mefarshim say they threatened to kill, others say they actually killed them. And what's crazy to note is that in the Shulchan Aruch and Samatav Kuf Pei, when it says about fasting on Tes Ba'adar, because that's the day Shenechliku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, the El Yerabah Afanar says, and he brings this from a girsa that comes from the Megillah, from the Masechtas Tainus, that says, Oiseh hayom hargu Talmidei Shammai shleishes alafim Talmidei Hillel. 3,000 Talmidei Hillel were killed on the day that Shammai's Talmidim tried to establish the halachic Maisam. So this is in Al Yerabah and Shulchan Aruch. So meaning there's different girsayos, there's different nuschayos. There's kind of a steer between the girsa of the Yerushalmi and the girsa of the Megillas Tainus. But in any case, this was a day that the Gemara itself says, the Yerushalmi itself says, was kasha li Yisrael kiyem shenasa by ha'egel. This was a terrible day in Klal Yisrael's history. The day that the Machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel spilled out of control and turned violent, and also went the wrong direction, because the halacha was passing like Beis Shammai that day, and not like Beis Hillel, how the halacha is supposed to be. Now, at some seif, it took a heavenly intervention to resolve this Machlokes and to bring it to a close. The Gemara in Erev in Daf Gimel and Beis tells us as follows. It says, Amar Rav Abba Amar Shmuel, Shloisha shanim nechleku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. For 3 years, a pitched battle raged between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Halalu Emrim halacha k'meisenus, meaning this is clearly not all the 360 machlokes going on. That happened over a period of 100 years. This is like the culmination of the machlokes. When it got to the point where there was such a distinction between Shammai and Hillel that a simple Jew looking to know what the halacha is couldn't know what to do in hundreds of circumstances. So for 3 years, the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel argued over who should be the halacha. How should we designate the halacha? Halalu Emrim halacha k'meisenu, halalu Emrim halacha k'meisenu. So it says Yatzis Abaskal v'Amra. A Baskel came out and it said, Elu ve'elu divrei l'kim chayim. Both of these are divrei l'kim chayim hein. The halacha ke Beis Hillel, but the halacha is like Beis Hillel. So the Gemara says, V'chim ya'achar she'elu ve'elu divrei l'kim chayim, pnei ma zacha Beis Hillel l'kvei halacha ke Maisan. So if they're both true, they're both Elu ve'elu divrei l'kim chayim, how was Hillel zeicha that the halacha should be ke Maisai? Pnei shenoichin v'aluvin hayu. They were noichin, they were nice, v'aluvin and humble. V'sheinin divrei v'divrei Beis Hillel. They would say their words and Beis Shammai's and Beis Shammai's words in the same memra. V'loi oidel shemakdim divrei Beis Shammai l'divrei. They would even precede Beis Shammai's words before they said the words of Beis Hillel. And the Gemara continues on and says this is the halacha. So it took Mamash a Baskel and Shamayim to resolve this raging machlekes of Shammai and Hillel that spans throughout all 6 halakim of Mishnayos and many hundreds of Mishnayos. And this is the resolution of the machlekes, is that the halacha is like Beis Hillel, not like Beis Shammai. Now,
were there other machlekes going on during
at the same time. So once the what do you call it? And the Spar da Chavila. Once the door opens, then there's many other machlokes, to which the Gemara and Chagig and the Fez Beis says this like almost wistfully. Like, how is a person, by the time the Gemara comes around, hundreds of years later, the Gemara is writing like, how is a person anymore supposed to know what the right thing to do is? When it says, kulam echad, they all come from one place, and even though halal matar and lamatamin, and we have, so I'll talk about that in a second, the drop actually. So 1 second. So there's many machlokes after this, but the halacha b'sham and halacha b'sil was kind of settled. To which the Gemara in Eruvin tells us that the Gemara in Eruvin tells us la'olam halacha b'sil. Really, the halacha is like b'sil, but v'haroitze lasses k'div b'shamay oisa. Someone who wants to do like b'shamay can do like b'shamay. Meaning, we have now the Gemara resolved. The Baskel came in and said the halacha is like b'sil, but the Gemara in Eruvin Davav tells us that still haroitze lasses k'div b'shamay could do it. Now the Gemara brings a few iterations of this. The Gemara ends up saying, it's shver because halacha b'sil, and the Gemara says no, it could be one's before the baskel, one's after the baskel. Meaning, maybe this member that says you're allowed to do like b'sil, like b'shamay is before the baskel and after the baskel. And the other one says maybe if you're a direct Talmud, you're allowed to do like it. That's what the Gemara seems like. The Gemara seems to be winding down the ability to paskel like b'shamay. Now, what we know even more so is the Mishnah in Brachas, in the first parak, in the end of the first parak, the Mishnah tells us that there's machlokes b'shamay b'sil how to read Kriya Shema. Do you lean or do you stand? Do you? B'sil says, do whatever. Stand, lean, sit, whatever. B'shamay says, no, it depends. Morning Kriya Shema, night time Kriya Shema. The Mishnah tells us that Reb Tarfon did like b'shamay because he was a Talmud of b'shamay. But it says, v'sikanti ba'atzmi, I put myself in danger. Right, because I almost got killed from that. To which the Gemara, Dafir Aleph and Aleph, in Bracha's comments, it says, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Asa Kedev b'shamay chayiv misa. Someone who does like b'shamay is chayiv misa. The Tanan Amar of Tarfon, Ani hisi baba derech, v'teisi likris Kedev b'shamay, v'sikanti ba'atzmi. Amrulay kedai hisi alacha v'atzmi chashavar to divrei beis. So the Mishnah in Brachas, in the end of the day, and the Gemara seems to put a finality to it, that the halacha is like Beis Hillel, come what may, the halacha is like Beis Hillel. So now, this is the whole walkthrough. Most of these should be familiar, at least some of them should be familiar. These are the Gemaras, the Mishnayos, the Toseftas that are relevant, the Yerushalmis that are relevant to the Machlokes b'Sham b'Sil. Now I present to you a Gemara in regard to Hilchas Chanuka that seems to be a little bit, a davar tamua in regards to this. The Gemara says like this. Tana Rabbanan, Mitzvahs Chanuka ner shabeisai. We know this is a famous Gemara, Chafal from Beis and Shabbos. V'mahadrin ner l'chalechad ve'echad. B'shamay says you light 8 on the first day. You diminish as you go on. 7, 6, 5, 4. You light 1 candle on the first day. You build up all the way to 8. And this is a bakanta machlokes b'sham b'sil as I state in the Gemara. And we know what the halach is. We're all regular Shulchan Aruch observant Jews. So we know the halacha is that we light like Beis Hillel says. You start with 1, you work your way up to 8. Now there's a davar tamu in this Gemara. The Gemara continues for a little bit, discussing what the 2 positions are, and then the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rav Yechanan, Shnei Zekanim hayu b'Tzidan. 2 unnamed Zekanim lived in Tzidan. Echad asa k'Beis Shammai. One of them did like Beis Shammai, ve'echad asa k'Devrei Beis Hillel, and one did like Beis Hillel. Zenois in time ledvarav connected Priya Chag, Zenois in time ledvarav the Malam HaKodesh ve'Meridin. This is Bakant. This is the 2 sugyas, the 2 rationales for Beis Shammai's position and Beis Hillel's position. Now, what's odd is that the Gemara is bringing us almost like, with this, the Gemara closes the sugya. It's almost like the Gemara is bringing us a Ma'aser Rav of doing like Beis Shammai or Beis Hillel. Meaning, we just went through the whole hishtalshus of the machlokes and the culmination and the conclusion that we very strongly believe we have to adhere to halachic Beis Hillel. And ad kedei kach that the Mishnah says if you do like Beis Shammai, it's sikanta b'atzmcha and kedayu that you should be sakana. And over here, the Gemara in Shabbos brings that in regards to this halacha regarding mahadrin and mahadrin, there's a dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, but there's 2 zekanim, and each one did one way, and the Gemara doesn't seem to have any problem with that. What's even more shver about it is that the Rif, who only brings the halacha l'maisa elements of the Gemara, brings the Shnei zekanim part. He brings this din, Shnei zekanim haisu, and they did these 2 mahalchim. So what's going on over here? Why does this suddenly seem to be like a dispensation that in Hilchas Chanukah over here, we're allowing ourselves to overlook the regular halacha of halacha Beis Hillel, and we say, no, if you want to do like Beis Shammai, you're good to go. Now, there's one very straightforward teretz and one less straightforward teretz. I don't think I'm going to have time for both. So let's say the less straightforward teretz. The straightforward teretz, what do you say? Both? Both? The straightforward teretz is that there's actually some Rishonim that say this, and it's really a lamdish shtickle, but there's some, we know, everyone who's learned Chanukah or went to any Chanukah party in yeshiva knows that there's a whole lamdish sugya if the din of Hiddur mitzvah is b'chlal the mitzvah itself, or Hiddur Mitzvah is like a David Stadi, like a Zaytik thing that's separate. Briskirov, the Beis Halevi, the elements familiar, there's a Torah, the Rambam, whatever it is. Now, there is Rishonim in the Shita Miyuchas L'Ritva on this Gemara, and the Bir Halacha brings it down on his own. He seems to say it on his own in Simon Tafresh Ayin Aleph that says that this is only a machlekes about Hiddur Mitzvah. This is not a machlekes about a core din. This is just a machlekes about how to be mahader. In Hiddur Mitzvah, it's not halachas. Halachas is not like Beis Hillel. Meaning, in the Inyan of Hiddur Mitzvah, it's about making things nice. So do whatever resonates with you. If that's what you feel is making the mitzvah nice, making the mitzvah beautiful, so do that. There's no halacha psuka like there is by all of the mitzvah bir halacha in Simon Tafresh Ayin Aleph and Simon Beis. You can look it up. Mishra bir halacha does not want to stay with a halacha lemaisa, but he says it as a tzad. But that's bekitzer, the straightforward teretz. The less straightforward teretz is as follows. There's a Messiah, let's just call it. Klal Yisrael has a Messiah. It's brought down. Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz says it somewhere. Rav Chaim Volozhiner says it in the name of the Goyin somewhere. The Shlah says it somewhere. There's many more. Gedolei Elam who bring down this Messiah. What's strange is that each one of them quotes it from a different makar. One says it comes from the Kisvei Arizal. One says it comes from the Zohar. One says it comes from the Yerushalmi. One says it comes from a Medrash. And usually when you see so many different makaris, it's because it's not findable in any one of them. Meaning nobody's able to find it. We don't have a Gemara, a Bavli, Yerushalmi, a Medrash, a Zohar, even Kisvei Ari. Now I'm not an expert, but there are people who did the searches, and we don't have an actual makar for this Messiah. But it's a Messiah that's musmach, meaning by many, many Gedolei Elam, spanning all Kreise. The Kedushas Levi says it somewhere, the Bnei Yisachar says it somewhere, the Goyin of Chaim Volozhiner, it's literally, it cuts across all preconceived, borders and divisions in different Messiahs and Klal Yisrael. So it seems to be something that everyone had from wherever they had it from, that says as follows. That says that the Yemaisa Mashiach, La'asad Lavai, halacha is going to be like Beishamai. Now, I have a novelty sefer over here, halacha Beishamai, La'asad Lavai. This is a whole sefer to try to find and figure through it and work it through. And I'm going to tell you, spoiler alert, even he doesn't have a makar at the end of it, where it comes from. Meaning, earliest sources from Svarim a few hundred years ago, like 400 years ago. I think we refer to them as like Svarim Akdeshim, Kadmoinim. You know what I'm saying? They're not even names that you'd be familiar with. Meaning like Svarim that people had that said it. There's actually some Gemaras that are shver, if you say this. I'll just say it very quickly. We're running out of time. But the Gemara in Beya on Daf Dalet, I think, says that we don't allow you to eat eggs that were born. It's machlekes b'sham b'sil, eggs that were born on Yom Tov, if you're allowed to eat them or not. Now the Gemara says, what about a 2-day Yom Tov? The Gemara eventually goes to talk about Rosh Hashanah, 2 days Yom Tov for Rosh Hashanah, which is really Yom HaRichta. It's a ganze lange sugi that we don't have time to go into now. I think we actually talked about it a little bit Rosh Hashanah time. The Gemara says we don't allow it on Rosh Hashanah because Meheiri Yibana HaMikdash, Mitzvah the Beis HaMikdash will be built. And they're going to say, Ishtakid Mila Yachalnu, did we not eat the bay that was nolda from this to this, and now we're not able to, because now it's Yom HaRichta again, so what's going to be? Now the kasha is, that Beishamai in the Mishnah in Beya says you're allowed to eat a bay shenolda b'yamtiv. If we're going to paskin like Beishamai Lasad Lavai, the whole thing's a moot point, Lasad Lavai. It's not even relevant. From the fact that the Gemara seems to say, Ishtakid Mila Yachalnu, we make a gzeira to not allow even Bizman Hazeh because of Lasad Lavai, it sounds like Lasad Lavai, the halach is not going to be like Beishamai. And this is a thing that was, again, everybody and their cousin has something to say about it. Meaning there's 12 terutzim to it, and there's dozens of stories of different people who met each other and asked each other this question. He said so, and he said so, and chayna chayna. But Yirchiyah, this is a Messiah that exists. That halachik b'shamay. If someone wants, you could take a peruse. It comes from. But the point is what I want to say. In total seriousness, though, something that the Goyin, Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz, the Bnei Yisachar, the Kedushas Levi, all say has some sort of Messiah. Meaning, even if we're not able to source it and we don't know exactly where it comes from today, or it's not findable, it has some sort of Messiah. This comes from somewhere. That this is halacha b'sham v'lasalav. Now, what does that have to do with Chanuka? So this is again something that literally all the Svarim Akdeshim talk about, and each one b'signon shelahem, and we don't have close to enough time to go into it. But there's a pasuk in Tehillim that says, pasuk in Tehillim says, "Arachti ner l'mashichi," and almost all you'll find it in dozens, maybe tens, hundreds of places, hundreds of Svarim that say that on Chanukah, the Ner Chanukah, there's misnaitzitz Eirish al Mashiach. The light of Chanukah has something to do with the Eirish al Mashiach. Now, whatever version you want to go into, there's Gematrius, there's literally Pardes, Pshat, Drosh, Remesh, Sayyid, there's tons of Svarim that talk about it, etc. On Chanukah, the Neiris Chanukah have some sort of connection to the Eirish al Mashiach that's being misnaitzitz, the light of Mashiach that's beginning to crackle and sparkle, that's beginning to shine and show. And Memela, on maybe, Ulay, Yachal Leimar, that on Chanuka, when the neiris of Chanuka are the Misnaitzes Eresh Mashiach, and there is this Messiah that lasted lavei halacha kebeshamai, is why the Gemara on Shabbos was comfortable with Shnei Zkenim Ma'aseh B'tzidin. One did like Beshamai, one did B'Hillel, because on Chanukah we kind of live in this duality of Eilam Hazeh and lasted lavei. They both have a place on Chanukah, and it's possible to have halacha like this and halacha like this on Chanukah. Now, stam interesting to know, and I'll end with this, is that the song of Ma'is Tzor that the most common piyut that we say on Chanukah is Ma'is Tzor. Right now, I don't have a siddur in front of me, but if someone has Ma'is Tzor has six stanzas, right? Now, if you go through it with the taich, you just find it. If you go through it with the taich, it's talking about all the different gullus that Klal Yisrael was in and that they were rescued from. Now, if you look at the acrostic of how songs usually go, the mechaber of the song was someone named Mordechai. Because if you look, it starts with Ma'is Tzor, that's Mem, Roy Yeshiva is Reish, Devir Kadsha is Dalid, Chrois Kaima is Kaf, and Roy Sheminin is, and then Yevanim Nikvatzu is Yod, that's Mordechai. But then there's a sixth piyut, there's a sixth stanza to this that says Chasayv Zroya Kachecha, which again, way above my pay grade, but if you know rhyme and music, you would know that this is not a matching with the rest of the piyut. It's clearly a later edition. I do not know that, but if one knows, the Chachamim in this field say that it is not a matching kruz. Now, where does it come from? It comes from the Siddur Kitzur Ashla, which was published like 400 years ago, where they said that the Madfis of the Siddur says the kruz only has 5 because it only goes up to the Nisim and the Galasin of its day. But Klal Yisrael's redemption from the final Galus, from this last Galus that we're in, is not in there yet. But Ba'atzim, this Pisman is built to include another stanza to talk about the Gula Asida, the Misnaitzes Ner LaMashichi, the Mashiach that's coming on, that's the Irish Mashiach that's being Misnaitzes on Chanukah. And in there he brings down 5 or 6 different suggestions for what the 6th stanza to this piyut should be. One of them comes from the Ramah, one of them comes from they all come from different places. The first one over there was Chasayv Zroya, and likely just because of pride of place, because it was Zeichet to go first, is why it became the most successful one, the most popular one. But if you look in this Kitzur Siddur Shlah from a long time ago, and you see all these 6 suggested additional stanzas, you'll see they're all about Mashiach. Everyone who is writing a 6th Pisman is suggesting that there's this Irish Mashiach that's being Misnaitzes on Chanukah that we're waiting to talk about. We're waiting to talk about the Geula Asidah, the Mashiach that's coming at the end of this dark night, at the end of these lights that we're lighting. So Ulai Beishamai Misil in this context, we're in Shabbos Chafalef.
That's why the Kabbalah is so busy.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.